Hello class. In the previous lecture we discussed the elements of rhythm. We discussed the length of notes, the types of notes, their names, how the notes are organized on the piece of music, and how we can read those notes and rhythm lengths. The lecture before that we discussed what music was. We said that music was comprised of essentially two elements at its base form: rhythm and pitch. Pitch meaning nothing more than how low or how high a note sounds. A very high pitch, a very, very low pitch. Right? And musicians have devised a way of organizing these pitches. And in fact, when we go back to the earlier lectures, we notice that there was a pattern on the keyboard. And the way we organize pitches is also a pattern. In fact, it's something you already know. It's organized by letters of the alphabet, right? And we only use 7 letters in the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. After we hit a G on the piano, the next note is an A. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. And if we can hear, these A's sound similar. Those are all A's on the piano, right? Likewise, these two notes do not sound similar. They sound okay together, but they're not. They do not have the same letter name. This is an A and an E versus an A and an A. What we would say is 1 octave apart. Vocabulary term. Write that down. So now that we've learned the names of the notes, their letter names, I would say, we have to go one step further, and that is organizing it on a staff, right? And what is a staff? What we have here, these 5 lines right here, is what we would call a staff. Every staff we come across in music, whether it be jazz, country, pop, classical, right? Even music outside the Western hemisphere as we know it, the Western influence. Gamelan from Indonesia, right? Hindi music, right? Chinese and Japanese music, all written on 5 lines on a staff. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to organize this staff so that we can better understand how to hear and how to read what's written on this staff. What I'm drawing is something called the grand staff. And the grand staff is something that's quite unique to pianists. It is because pianists have 2 hands. It would get really complicated putting all the notes on 5 lines of music for both hands playing at the same time, wouldn't it? So pianists read something called the grand staff. Excuse me, I forgot a bar line that ties it together. There we go. The grand staff, right? This is what the grand staff looks like, and this is what pianists read. You might say the top line, or the top staff, I should say, notates the notes for the right hand. And the bottom staff, with the bass clef, is for the left hand. So whenever we see notes written on the very top staff, we know that they will always, 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 without fail, be played with our right hand. As we can see, the abbreviation for right hand, abbreviation for left hand, LH, RH. Likewise, if we see notes written on this bottom staff, we know that they will always be played with the left hand. Now hopefully you can pause the video, maybe write that down, maybe jot down some notes in your book, and take notes so that you can remember this a little bit easier. And if you go to the beginning of your book, right, from pages 1 all the way up to page 18, right, are notes on what I'm discussing right now, and you can easily access that, right? What I'm going to talk about next is maybe some general questions that a lot of my students have when they first start out playing piano. And they might come across something like this. And some of them might say, well, I play one first and one second, right? No, this is not the case. These notes are played at the very same time. The very, very same time. If notes are stacked right on top of one another, they are played at the same time. Now let's look at another example here, and let's continue this melody out. What I'm doing now is writing down some things that you might experience in piano music that you encounter in this class. And we're going to see how this is played. So, here we have a combination of notes that we've already studied, at least the duration of them. We see a half note, quarter notes, half note. In the bass clef, we see a whole note and two half notes, right? So, we can see that this whole note is played at the same time as this right hand note. But these notes are also played over the top of this note. So while this note is being held out, these notes are sounding in the right hand. While these notes are played at the same time, this note is played immediately after while this note is being held down, correct? Because a half note, as we recall from the previous lecture, is worth 2 beats of music. 2 beats, 1, 2. 2 quarter notes, 2 beats. And these notes are played at the very same time. So let's listen to what this piece of music might sound like. Right? So, that's a kind of a crash intro into what you might encounter. Now, we've still yet to get to the most important part, and that is how we label our notes on the staff. Well, I'm going to write this down. And what I find very helpful, and many students find very, very helpful, is to come up with some sort of saying that'll help you remember the names of the notes on the staff, right? And we're going to start with our treble clef, which is played by the right hand. And the names of the notes on the lines, the letter names that attach them, are E, G, B, D, and F. Likewise, the names of the spaces are F, A, C, E. Pretty easy, they spell face, right? Pretty easy to remember. Now, how did we come up with this? Well, if we look here, this bottom line is E. And we ask ourselves, well, what's the next letter in the alphabet after E? Well, it's F. And F is on that space. After that space, we continue up and we hit a line. Well, after F in the alphabet is G. After that line, we have a space to A. And what do we say after we encounter G? We go back to the beginning of the alphabet, A, up to B, space C, line D, space E, line F. Now this might seem kind of arbitrary for you, and indeed for beginning musicians it kind of is arbitrary. It's like, why do we start on E? Why is the bottom line E? Why don't we just call that A? Well, that is a very lengthy lecture for another class and another time. For now, I think one of the easiest ways to memorize this is to assign a sentence to it. I know that a lot of students and a lot of teachers use this method. E, G, B, D, F, every good boy does fine, right? Every good boy does fine. That's an easy way to remember that. So if you're trying to figure out a note on the staff, and say a quarter note is written right here, you would say, well, I know the bottom line's E, so the space up above that must be F, and that is where that note is written. Now, let's take a look at the bass clef, and no, you would think it would be exactly the same, but it is not the same. Unfortunately, it is not the same. The lines on the bass clef are G, B, D, F, and A. I had one student in one class, and he came up with a very clever sentence to help him remember that. And he said, "Good burritos don't fall apart." I think he'll remember that the rest of his life. The spaces on the bass clef are A, C, E, and G. Or as I was taught, all cows eat grass, right? These are just silly ways, silly mnemonics of how to memorize and how to help yourself learn the names of the notes on the staff. In a later video, I'll discuss alternate ways of helping you learn the notes and be able to play piano immediately without learning the names of the notes as quickly. And eventually we'll get to that point. But I'd like to get everyone started off learning and playing music immediately in my classes, and I know a method, of how we can do that. So for now, we're going to conclude this lecture of naming the notes on the staff and how we play those notes. So let's review with what we learned. We learned the grand staff, right? We learned that it comprises of two staffs. The top staff being the treble clef, which our right hand plays in, and the bottom staff being the bass clef, the bass staff, where our left hand plays. We also learned that when notes are stacked on top of one another in either clef, could be two notes in the bass clef, two notes in the treble clef, or one note in the treble clef and one note in the bass clef. Those notes are sounded, in other words, are pressed on the piano, hit, played, however you want to call it, at the very same time. We also learned that when we have a whole note being held, and there's a bunch of notes above it, say there's 4 notes above it, that note is held for the duration of those 4 notes, such as this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So that note was held down the entire time. I didn't just hit it once and then leave it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? And then finally we concluded our lecture today with the naming of the notes on the staff. And I encouraged you to help yourself learn and prepare better for reading music, to come up with a sentence, a word that matches each of those. I gave an example of the bass clef, G, B, D, F, A. Good burritos don't fall apart, and indeed they don't. It's a funny saying. It's true, and it's going to help you memorize the names on those of the notes on the staffs that much easier. Okay? So, absorb this information, learn this information, and practice this information. And when you're ready, go on to the next video.